Thank you everyone for coming. This panel is titled Migration in the 21st Century. I think you would have seen from the program that it's supposed to be a World Cafe, that the format has changed to a panel presentation. I hope you don't mind. So let me first introduce the three speakers, and then they will proceed with their presentations in the same order. We will perhaps ask questions right at the very end, and you're welcome to ask the questions to a specific presenter or to all three. Let me start with a very distinguished professor on my right, Professor Lorraine Gelstorp. She is currently a professor at the Institute of Criminology. She is also Director of Undergraduate Education of the department and the past Director of the MPhil program. She sits on the university's General Board of Education, Equality, and Diversity, and also the Researcher Development Committee, as well as also the Executive Committee of the University Counseling Service. She is Director of the ESRC Doctoral Training Program across the social sciences within the university. She is also a joint convener of CAMIGRES, the Cambridge Migration Society, which is an interdisciplinary network relating to research on migration. She started CAMIGRES in late 2013 with Professor Madeleine Arnott from Education. The next presenter we have is our own Gates scholar and a very distinguished person himself, Fabrice. And I never dare to pronounce his surname despite knowing him for almost 2 years. So Fabrice was once the youngest judge in France, the youngest administrative judge in France. He specializes on asylum cases. He is currently doing a PhD in history, looking also at migration, but of a different period to what's going to be talked about in this panel. He is also the founder and current president of the Cambridge Migration Society. And the Cambridge Migration Society is slightly different from CAMIGRES in the sense that it is a student-run body organization that does a lot of sometimes non-academic seminars
for a variety of things. And Sabrina is part of the society.
I'm part of the society.
Yes, of not falling in line with the official,
because he's my boss technically. So, well, as you can see, I've been asked to, moderate this panel about 10 minutes ago, so I'm sorry for the...
It is true, and Andrea, who's listed on your program, has to apologize to all of you because her daughter is sick and she couldn't make it.
Yes, so Fabrice and Andrea co-founded the Cambridge Migration Society, and there are also scholars from later years who joined the society and become members of the committee, so we do welcome any expression of interest for the subsequent years. And our last distinguished speaker is none other than Glenys Newton. She was trained in mental health social work, and she worked as a mental health social worker for quite some time. She would describe herself as a storyteller and writer. She has also published a number of books. For the past year, she was involved in a project called the Cambridge Calais Refugee Action Group. Before that, she spent a year in northern France and in Greece, working with refugees on the ground. At the moment, the Cambridge Calais Refugee Action Group sent a convoy of about 20 to 30 people each time with donation of goods and money gathered from around Cambridge, taking them to Calais to be distributed among refugees. She is also intending to look at the mental health aspects of refugee and forced migration in the near future. So could we please welcome our panelists?
over to me. I'll stand up so that you can see me, if that's all right. Well, what I want to do is really focus on some elements of policy in relation to immigration. I'm very critical of government in this regard, but barely a day goes by without there being something in the newspapers about immigration. Lots of myths, muddles and misconceptions, it seems to me. And I'm particularly concerned about victims of human trafficking who get caught up in the debates about immigration, and because I think that government is neglecting its duty to some extent. So what I thought I would do, as well as posing some difficult questions, which I think we're hoping you will answer, I will draw on some research that I did 2 or 3 years ago relating to the criminalisation of migrant women. So these are women who've ended up in the criminal justice system, but have been humanly trafficked along the way. But they've ended up in the criminal justice system for not having proper papers, or having a false passport, or being made working on a cannabis farm, something like that, production of cannabis. But first of all, let me say something about the reasons why there might be so many concerns about migration at the moment and immigration. What is it? What's got into the British public in terms of all the myths and muddles and misconceptions? Why is it that everybody is so concerned, and why is there so much ignorance? Why are people impervious to the knowledge, appropriate knowledge about immigration? Well, it seems to me that we need to think about social context. And if we think about changes, social, political, economic changes in the last 20, 30, 50 years perhaps, if we consider late modernity, that period from the 1950s onwards, we can see that there's been a revolution in terms of social changes, many social changes, and arguably those social changes have led to fear, anxiety, and ontological insecurity, insecurity from within. That ontological insecurity is partly economic, with people not being sure of a lifetime job, but having a number of jobs, having portfolio careers. There's fear of redundancy. There is an erosion of trust also between employers and employees, government and citizens. And arguably we live in a culture of risk, not least because of the tragic events, for example, in Nice yesterday, and other such events. Terrorism makes us afraid, and it really contributes to a culture of risk that means that we're always alert to risk. And I think that that has led to the fear of the other as well. So all these changes, rapid social, technological, political, economic changes, have contributed to a culture of risk. I think shown very clearly in a book by Jock Young, the vertigo, the dizziness of late modernity, the dizziness of all the changes in the last 50 years. We live in dangerous times. We're acutely conscious of danger everywhere, and we're afraid of the others, anyone who's different. So the state fails to contribute to security in a way, and I think that means that there is then a focus on readily identifiable targets where the state can be seen to act decisively. Whenever there is social change and rapid social change, one can see that criminal justice policies get tougher. Well, offenders are an easy target. If you target offenders, government can demonstrate that it's doing something, all is well in the world, government is in control. It's a kind of reassurance policing approach. But within this approach, I think my questions, this is where we get to the difficult concern, my questions and my concerns are about how we can protect victims of human trafficking in all of this. Of course, you'll be aware of differences between smuggling and trafficking. Smuggling, where people actually, of their own volition, set out to travel to a different place, to migrate to a different place. Human trafficking is when people are coerced to do so. But very often, smuggling turns into human trafficking. Halfway through the journey, having paid for a false passport to migrate to another country, halfway through the journey, the smugglers may say, well, we want your passports, false as they are, and people become then coerced in different ways. So, in the UK, there have been all sorts of attempts to respond to European Union directives to safeguard victims in the process. I have to say that the UK government was a latecomer to the table. Most other countries had joined in Europe. UK joined late, but has been trying to catch up in terms of protecting victims. And the main way of protecting victims is actually through something called the National Referral Mechanism, which means that there are trained observers and interviewers in the system, in border controls, in the police. I don't know whether in social work as well, but certainly one or two other agencies where people are trained to look out for victims of human trafficking and to respond to them so that they're not swept up in all these changes in regard to the criminal justice system. So there are first responders, trained first responders who are meant to be sensitive to human trafficking. And they will then send the case through to a competent authority who will consider whether or not the person really has been humanly trafficked. And if so, they should be dealt with in a more sensitive way, an appropriate way, relating to the human trafficking. And they'll look at the reasonable grounds for someone to stay if they're in fear of their life and so on. Interestingly, the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, has in the last few years come out quite strongly to say, yes, it's in the public interest to stop the prosecution where offences are committed whilst in a coerced situation. So the hundreds of women who each year are found in cannabis production farms in East Anglia, for example, they would hopefully be picked up by the system because they're being forced to work in those cannabis farms. And there needs to be better protection for them. So the European Convention relating to trafficking and the prevention of trafficking defines trafficking as acts such as recruitment, receipt, transportation. The means, you can see threats, coercion, deception, and exploitation is part of the definition too. So anyone who experiences these things should be seen as and responded to as a victim in the system. Victims in custody have been arrested for illegal entry into the country, false instrument, false passport, that sort of thing, work in illegal activities like production of cannabis farms, being in possession of false documents, so on and so forth. So those are criminal offences. So we have a group of people who are offenders, but they're also victims. And my concern is, well, how can we sort the offenders and victims, and how can we best protect the victims? So the research that I have been doing in the last few years and continue to do, it relates to detection of those victims. Various groups in the country have raised concerns and have tried to offer practical help to this group of people. My own research is on migrant women workers, but the problem is that some women continue to escape detection. Some women who are victims continue to escape detection and are very much seen as offenders. Whether or not this is conspiracy or just a clumsy system, I think it's hard to say. So the aim of the research has been to fill in gaps about migrant women in custody and to see how best to improve the procedures to ensure that we can protect them. What did we find? Well, actually, I should just say what we did. In this particular study, we went into places of custody, we went into prisons, we went into immigration centres in the south of England. We didn't go into every prison. We thought if we took a sample of 5 prisons and immigration detention centres, looked at who was in there and whether or not there might be any victims, that would give us a good idea of how many women might be escaping this national referral mechanism. So we did interviews with interpreters whom we chose ourselves. We didn't trust the government into the government translators. We wanted to choose our own translators, and obviously because women were frightened, it took several attempts to talk to them. We had to do it very sensitively and over time. In the end, the women did talk to us very, very candidly in the main. So we talked with 103 migrant women across the 5 institutions, and we found 43 of them had entered the country at the hands of traffickers, which was astonishing. 43 out of 103 migrant women. Why had they not been picked up by the authorities, the first responders? Why was nobody responding to their stories? Why was nobody asking them about their stories, about how they arrived in the country? It was absolutely appalling. And it remains on my heart. One particular interview, it was the 3rd interview that we had done with a young woman. She'd been in custody for 6 months. She had been found without proper papers, working on a cannabis farm, so she'd been prosecuted, given a custodial sentence. And we asked her at the end of the 3rd interview, well, have you anything you want to ask us? And she said, yes, I want to know when I'm going to be shot. Absolutely appalling that nobody in the system had explained to her what was happening, what was going to happen. At the end of her sentence, which was a 9-month sentence, she was going to be deported. I dread to think what would happen when she got back in the original country. But it made me feel very ashamed of the British criminal justice system, that no one had picked up her victimisation. We also had another group, a small group of women who'd entered the country independently, but they had then fallen into slavery or servitude. So having been smuggled in, they then found themselves in difficult circumstances where they were kept in custody by, again, by drug smugglers and drug producers, cannabis producers, or they were made into sex slaves in the sex industry. So we followed up we followed them all up in various ways. There were some very common socioeconomic factors behind their vulnerability to recruitment. You know, why it was that they had been trafficked, why it was that they'd agreed to be, wanted to be smuggled here. Vulnerability in their own countries, no work, little work, domestic work, non-skilled work. 20 women in their own countries had been forced to work in prostitution, cannabis production, domestic servitude, and the main offences are here again. So a very vulnerable group. These were the 3 countries, Nigeria, Vietnam, China, the 3 countries from which women came in the main, and the reasons were to access work or to seek asylum, or a mixture of these things. Sometimes it was to access education. Their experiences, as you might imagine, were ones of disempowerment and increased vulnerability. No rescue, no protection, but increased vulnerability. very socially isolated, traumatised, absolutely traumatised, which again makes me wonder why it was that in the criminal justice system no one had picked up their vulnerability. No one had identified the fact that they were traumatised. This is two women talking here about their experiences. I left because my life was in danger, and then to arrive in the UK and to feel in danger again. In the second case, the family said that I was a witch and that I'd killed the father of my children. And so again, somebody else who'd fled, seeking asylum. Two other experiences: forced into sex work in the first comment, and then in the second comment, this is someone forced into sex work, not knowing quite what she was getting into, but forced into sex work eventually. So lack of victim protection comes through very, very strongly with limited access to legal aid support, limited asylum lawyers, appropriate legal help, and a very cruel, blunt criminal justice system. Even in a courtroom, imagine if you're from another country, you've been traumatised by the experience of human trafficking, coerced, forced into sex work, so on and so forth, then you find yourself in a very formal courtroom, asked whether you're guilty or not guilty. It's a foreign language, which the system doesn't explain well at all. So there have been some further EU directives to protect victims, but I would have to say that there's still further to go in terms of trying to ensure that policy and practice really do protect victims. So the implications of the research in conclusion are to do with working out better ways of identifying victims, training people better, whether it's in border control or elsewhere, police officers, managing victims through the system in a much more sensitive manner, working in the best interests of children, because sometimes people were separated from their children, placed in custody, and had no idea where their children were, worrying as well. So we need a practical approach to recognising victim offenders sooner. I'm linking those two ideas, victim offenders. And the highest cost of all in this, it seems to me, is falling below high standards of humane treatment. And it's that which makes me very ashamed of the system. So working to do better. So thank you.
I think I'll stand up. I can see everyone. Hi. Thank you. I'm going to just talk a bit about my work as a volunteer, volunteering with refugees, which kind of ties in, not quite as intellectual, but I started volunteering last July, and like many people, I'd heard of Calais, and it'd been on the news, and I kind of thought, well, who am I to do anything? Surely somebody must be doing something, because there you have the 5th and the 6th richest countries in the world. It cannot be that people are living like that. So, and then I was thinking, well, who am I to do anything anyway? My son was working at festivals and doing what's poshly called waste management. It's actually litter picking. And he was incensed by the amount of waste that is left behind at festivals. It's insane. People even leave caravans behind. It's mad. And so he started gathering tents and sleeping bags and boots and clothes and to send to homeless projects and to Calais. And I was actually on holiday, and I just got a text that said, I've volunteered you to go to Calais. We appear to now be activists. Oops. I had a van at the time, so I just drove to Calais. And to be quite honest, I was a bit nervous. And I couldn't believe what was there. Calais is fairly unique, if you can have fairly unique. It's either unique or it's not, I suppose. But generally, a refugee camp is of, you know, there's a Syrian refugee camp or a Palestinian refugee camp. But Calais has, I've counted over 20 different nationalities. Within that, you have different cultures, religions, languages, subcultures, and personalities. And it is within this narrative of fear and statistics that is fed to us that those individual stories get lost. And we're fed that there's a swarm of people and they're all coming to rape and pillage everybody. And actually, Calais, to get as far as Calais, it's not a cheap deal. It's about between £15,000 and £20,000 to get smuggled as far as Calais. So as a sweeping statement, obviously not everybody, you have a great deal of middle-class professionals. Take away any politics, anything, that's incredibly inefficient. You've got, yeah, you've got more engineers than you can shake a stick at. In November last year, I went over to Greece, to the Isle of Lesbos, to volunteer on the beaches there. There were, at that time, around 7,000 people a day arriving. And I did think, who am I? You know, I'm not a lifeguard, I'm not a doctor, I can't build things, I'm not particularly, you know, just a person. But one day, I was in Calais, and a little girl, she tugged at my sleeve, and she's a Kurdish Iraqi. And I got somebody to come and interpret. And she said, I remember you. She'd arrived in the night in Lesbos, 8 years old, Sunita. And she said, I remember your smile. And she said, and I carried your smile in my heart on my journey across Europe. Now we can all do that. That's free. And Sunita and Sam, little Sam, 3 years old, melts your heart, and they were in Calais. Their father actually has a British passport. They have a legal right to be in Britain. Sam was drugged on the journey over on the boat from Turkey to Greece. Most of the children were drugged, and it's probably a good thing. He will also have been drugged again when he was put in the back of a lorry to go from Calais to England. This is little Sam, who in his lifetime has seen more than most of us put together, and he had a legal right to be in Britain, to just get on a train. Calais is full of, you know, we talk about the Dublin regulation. I don't know if you know the offside rule in football. You kick the ball, if somebody's too far forward, it's like a humanitarian offside rule. You've gone too far. But for me, talking about the narrative of the other, this is what has happened. It's built up the narrative of the other, and these people's stories are being lost. When I see pictures of Calais and of people making their way across Europe, I just think of Rafat. Rafat is 21 years old, and I met him coming off of the boats. He was, he's from just outside Damascus. His city was originally of about 300,000 people, and his city have taken in over 1.5 million refugees. This is a city under siege, been under siege for 8 months. His city that has nothing has taken in more refugees than the whole of Europe. I met Rafat as he came off the boats. One of the things that most struck me about him, shoes were a big deal. you had to, on just my bit of beach were about 500 people a day. So you're looking to try and find 500 pairs of shoes a day, 500 trousers, everything. And I got a bit manic about the shoe situation. I'd have a line of really wet and just a bit wet, and they'd dry it out and try and match new shoes with more people arriving. It did feel a bit like you were putting dead man's shoes on the next person. Rafat came off of the boat with his trousers rolled up and his shoes in his hand. I said, could you please tell the other 1.5 million people about your shoe thing? And we stayed in touch. His family could afford to get one person out. It's not cheap. The young men are often the most vulnerable. The young men are the ones that are asked. They have to fight. Many of the young men making their way across Europe are the ones that don't want to kill anyone. I really like that in a person. Rafat is now in Germany, and I went to see him at Easter. And it's not clear. ISIS at this moment have taken over his town. So he doesn't know from one day to the next whether his family will survive or not. I can tell stories of Baghdad. Baghdad is 26 years old. He's an engineer, also from Iraq, and made his way overland. His mum wouldn't let him go in a boat. And I remember one night we were stood up on a hill and looking at a full moon, and he thanked me for my kindness, and I said, I don't really know what I've done. I don't know what I can do. But he's the same age as my son. So what I can do is be the person I would hope my son would meet if he was ever away from home and without family. Now that takes away all politics, that takes away all fear. In fact, it gives you a great deal of courage. When I first started going to Calais, I've been numerous times now, I started writing. I wrote a couple of articles, and some people from Cambridge got in touch and said, oh, we want to go to Calais. And then from that, this CAMCRAG, Cambridge Calais Refugee Action Group, has been formed. A real mixed bag. This is a good thing about the internet. You get a real mixed bag of people who ordinarily would never ever come together. And we have monthly convoys going over to Calais, usually between 20 and 30 people, and there's fundraising, and also another group that is campaigning for the resettlement of Syrian refugees in Cambridge. We've got loads, there's room, there's resources, there's people opening their doors saying, we'll have people, but the list from the government of what you have to offer is mildly insane. They have to have their own front door for a start, so you can't share your house, which doesn't seem very sensible because it'd be great to share a family. And we do ongoing fundraising and awareness, and recently there was a meeting of techie people around making apps for refugees, making the journeys, and also around protecting them with the information that is disseminated over the internet. Apparently the biggest kind of hacking thing is the Syrian technological army. So just by agreeing to use Google, for example, Assad's army are able to access any amount of information about you, and this is life-threatening. So there's something out there for everybody to do. So people have said to me, I wouldn't go and stand in the waters in Greece, but I would genuinely rather be up to the here in water than trying to muddle through an app. You know, there's something for everybody, and everybody can do something. And the only thing that isn't an option is nothing. Okay.